Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. So I'm Jason Kawal. I'm the director of the Lampert Institute for Civic and Global Affairs, and it's my great pleasure to be welcoming you to our talk this afternoon. And this is our third talk in our Crossing Borders, People and Cultures, Goods and Information series. Now, before introducing our speaker, I'd like to begin with a couple of announcements, just a couple quick ones. So first, I'd just like to remind everyone of the fellowship opportunities offered by the Lampert Institute. Again, these are both for students and faculty. And you can learn more on the Lampert Institute's website, and that's easily found through Colgate's site. And again, for students, there are summer fellowships supporting summer independent faculty-supervised research with stipends of $4,500 with up to $2,000 for travel. So it's a really amazing opportunity, and it's just open to Colgate students. And for faculty, there's support for a wide variety of projects. Applications are due in January, and especially for projects with any sort of international or civic affairs focus. But again, do look at our website for more details. The other announcement is just to draw attention to our next speaker in the series, and that will be Larissa McFarquhar, and she's a staff writer with The New Yorker. And she'll be presenting a paper titled Strangers Drowning, Altruism at Home and Far Away. And that'll be on Tuesday, November 15th at 4:30, and that'll be here again in Ho 101. Okay, so those are our little maintenance announcements there. So now we can turn to the main event. So I'm really happy to be introducing our speaker today. So Dr. Laura DeNardis is a globally recognized Internet governance scholar and a professor and associate dean in the School of Communication at American University. Her books include The Global War for Internet Governance with Yale University Press, Opening Standards, The Global Politics of Interoperability with MIT Press, and Protocol Politics, The Globalization of Internet Governance, also with MIT Press. With a background in information engineering and a doctorate in science and technology studies, her research studies the social and political implications of Internet technical architecture and governance. She's an affiliated fellow of the Yale Law School Information Society Project and served as its executive director from 2008 to 2011. She's also a senior fellow of the Center for International Governance Innovation. And she has many other affiliations and impressive accomplishments, so this is an abbreviated biography, I'll just say that. But more broadly, her expertise and scholarship has been featured in such venues as Science, The Economist, on NPR, New York Times, Christian Science Monitor, Slate, everywhere. Now, so with today's talk, we're focusing on the crossing of information across borders. So the transmission of such information has taken on an extraordinary importance, and the need to examine the complex structures, be it governance, be it technical, that underlie the Internet has never been more pressing. So please join me in welcoming Professor DeNardis as she presents her talk, Bits and Borders, Rethinking Internet Freedom in the Age of Global Cyber Governance.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in Colgate. I've actually never been here. I spent some time in Ithaca and never had a chance to get over here, and it's absolutely beautiful, and I'm enjoying the visit very much. As the professor mentioned, the title of my remarks is Bits and Borders, and what I'd like to do is to address some of the geopolitical tensions between national borders and the technologies that underlie the Internet that don't know borders and cross these kinds of divides that are based on sovereign nation states, and then explain what some of the public interest implications are around these tensions. In other words, why should we care? Now, a few people have asked me a little bit about my research agenda and my background. I'm usually described as a scholar of Internet governance, which is always really interesting to me because I think of myself as an engineer. And that's because Internet governance is an oxymoron, because it's not necessarily about governments. It's really about the technical design and the decisions of private companies. But the conceptual starting point of all of my work is that arrangements of the technology are also arrangements of power. So sometimes it's a little bit easier to describe what I don't study I don't really study content. I don't really study how people use the internet. And I don't really study the effects of using the internet. As a scholar with a background in science and technology studies, and in particular influenced by theories from the philosophy of technology, I look at the hidden technical infrastructures of the internet, the things that you can't really see. And what are some of these things? Well, some of it sounds kind of boring and dry, but what I'd like to do is to describe today why it's not boring and dry and why it's something we should all be concerned about. For example, the technical standards that all of the technologies we use are based on. Something called the domain name system, which I'll come back to in a minute. The internet exchange points where networks join together to form the global internet. And then all kinds of different systems that route information around and cross borders. But the distributed, I would call them the black boxes of the internet, the distributed black boxes of the internet. And I look at how the design and the governance of these kinds of technologies serve as politics by other means, which is a term that I take from my own dissertation advisor, Janet Abate, who wrote a book in 1999 called Inventing the Internet. Protocols are politics by other means. So you know that the internet is not actually a cloud, despite the fact that we draw it that way. What is it? We really only see three things when we use the internet. We see the content, we see the applications, and I'm really surprised that you're not on your devices right now. I see a few people with devices. If you want to get on Twitter, it's at Laura DeNardis, if you want to tweet anything out. But what is that? That's an application, and you see the content on the application, and then you see the device. But that is only 1% or less of the internet. There's a whole infrastructure that underlies this. You might also see a Wi-Fi antenna or a cell phone antenna on the side of the room. But what I'm interested in is the vast majority of the internet's infrastructure that is unseen. My background is in information technology engineering, including, as mentioned, my first 2 engineering degrees. I also did some professional practice designing computer networks. And the reason I mention that is because I did some work for the Department of Defense, some security clearance work, and I learned pretty quickly that how the technologies were designed around defense industries affected our civil liberties in very profound ways. So I'll come back to that as well. I also became interested in cybersecurity because when I was a graduate student at Cornell in the fall of 1988, the internet was taken down for the first time by what was called at the time a virus, but it was actually a worm. So you probably have heard about viruses and worms, and you have a virus checker on your computer, and you're not supposed to click on links that come through your email, and be careful about using, sharing drives and many things related to security. Well, in the fall of 1988, it was the first time that the internet was taken down by a major worm. Of course, not as many people used the internet at the time, but I used it for the same thing I use it for now, chatting with people. I was a graduate student. We used internet relay chat. We used email. And it turned out that the worm, it was an autonomous, self-propagating piece of code that disabled a lot of computers. Well, it turned out that got traced to a computer at MIT, and then it got traced to a computer at Cornell, and then it got traced to a computer in my building, Upson Hall, on the engineering quad, and then it got traced to another graduate student named Robert Morris, who launched this worm. He said he wanted to show some of the vulnerabilities in the internet. Wow, did that get me interested in security, especially when the feds came to investigate what was going on. So my background is something where I'm really very passionate about issues of cybersecurity and issues of internet governance and basically the power struggles that ensue over the technology. I just wanted to mention also that I spent 5 years at a law school, so my lens really is an interdisciplinary mashup between public policy, law, and also technical design. So did you know that the internet will soon turn 50? If you count, there are many ways to count it, but if you start it based on when the first packets were exchanged over the internet's predecessor network, ARPANET, in the late 1960s, it really will turn 50 fairly soon. That's far too long to discuss. That's an eternity in internet time, right? Let's just talk about 10 years in internet time. what was happening about 10 years ago on the internet? Now, I know all of you were probably on a computer or video games or on a device. What was going on about roughly 10 years ago? Do you remember? What are some of the things? I just jotted a few down here. Okay, the Facebook, as it was originally called, was recently launched at Harvard. On February 14th, I remember it was Valentine's Day on 2005, a new domain name launched called YouTube was activated. And I believe that same year we had the first United Nations report on the Internet of Things and many other things. But since that time, that's only 10 years ago. We've had the rise of Twitter, Reddit, connected drones, Google Glasses, the iPhone, the mobile internet, access around the world, the so-called Arab Spring, the Egyptian internet outage. We had Snowden's revelations of the expansiveness of the NSA surveillance practices, WikiLeaks, Instagram, Donald Trump's late-night Twitter postings, Hillary Clinton's email, Yahoo's security breach of 500 million users, and the Russian hacking of DNC emails. I could go on and on and on, but this is all in the last few years that these things have happened. The internet has grown to 3 billion users, and this will soon grow to 5 billion. One change is that the majority of that growth is in the developing world, with people accessing the internet from mobile phones. So much has changed in the last 10 years. One change is that the internet now really ranks very high on the policy agendas of governments in countries ranging from Russia and China to Brazil and the United States. I wrote a book called The Global War for Internet Governance, and I selected a provocative title. Now, I just want to be honest that one of my colleagues said in the title, I was struggling with the title a little bit, she said, why don't you use, as some publishers say, use violence, food, or sex in the title. I thought violence would be the safest, so I chose The Global War for Internet Governance as the title. But that really is, it really is what I mean. I selected the provocative title because the conflicts over control of the internet really have increasingly become spaces where global economic and political power is unfolding around the world. These different points of control on the internet mediate a number of civil liberties ranging from privacy to freedom of expression. They're certainly entangled with national security and innovation policy, but the distributed nature of the technologies is somewhat shifting control over these issues from traditional governments to private companies and to new kinds of global institutions that make decisions about how the information flows. And at the same time, these kinds of internet governance decisions have been traditionally so technically concealed, so I would call them institutionally concealed as well, and complicated, that they really have been to a certain extent outside of public view. But in only a decade, this area has gone from being of concern only to a small number of academics and technology policy people to being on the front burner of national policies. So when you see policies coming from, do you know what the G20 is? The group of 20 very economically developed countries, they got together. So they didn't just come out with information about climate change and environmental issues and the refugee crisis. They also had right mixed in there a paragraph about global internet policy. So it definitely is on the front burner, along with other kinds of collective action problems like terrorism and human rights. So why is this? Why has internet policy become so high on the policy agenda? Well, think about the importance of the internet. The economic stakes are really different than they were in 1988 when I was over there in Ithaca and the internet went out. So I couldn't use internet relay chat. That was no problem at all. But now the internet contributes more than $4 trillion to the global economy. Every single sector of the global economy relies on the internet just to function, from financial services to transportation to energy. The political and social stakes may even be higher when you think about how the internet increasingly underlies all of our social lives. The political sphere. So an outage in cyberspace is what now? It's an outage of our public sphere. It can be an outage of government. You don't have to look any further than, and maybe you haven't heard about this, but a while ago, the Estonian government servers were attacked, and the government couldn't communicate for days. It was called a distributed denial of service attack, which basically is the equivalent of someone flooding, let's say, a 911 dispatcher with so many calls that no one else can get through. It was like that. They were being bombarded, and the government couldn't function. So an outage in cyberspace is an outage of government, it's an outage of our social life, and it's an outage of the economy. So the stakes are extremely high when you look at this. But what does this term internet governance actually mean? The first point that I'd like to make is that the internet is governed, but there's a lot of misinformation about this. On one hand, there's this whole strain of thought that says it's this free-floating area that doesn't require any coordination. It just kind of handles itself. And then on the other hand, there are descriptions of internet governance as being something that's tightly controlled by the state. And as with most things, the truth is somewhere in between. And that the internet is governed, but it's not governed by any one system. There are many different functions that are necessary to keep the internet operational. In fact, the definition of internet governance that I would give is that it's the administration and the coordination of the technologies that are necessary to keep the internet running, and then the enactment of substantive policy around that. There are a number of tasks. I just jotted down a few here. So what on earth is all of this? Control of critical internet resources. When you go to get a domain name, let's say some of you start your own company and you go to apply for a domain name, like Colgate. Would you need a few more coffee shops here, or what do you need here, right? Okay, Colgate Cafe.com. You apply for that. What if someone else has applied for that, or if you own the trademark and someone else gets that domain name? There are institutions that make decisions about that. What happens when Amazon, the company, applies for a domain name, but the countries with the Amazonian rainforest within their borders say, you can't have it because that is something that should be owned by the territories? Well, that's a cross-border conflict between the private company that owns the trademark and the countries that are territorially bound and actually have the Amazon rainforest. So control of critical internet resources. There's also the issue of setting standards. So don't let the eyes glaze over by that. You've actually used a lot of standards that are really important today. Can anyone name a few of these? Who's on Wi-Fi right now? Wireless fidelity, that's a standard. HTTP, you've gone to a website, that's a standard. M4A, music, or the older MP3 file, that's a standard for the compression of audio. Bluetooth is a standard to do a number of different things. I could go on and on and on. Those things don't just happen either. There are institutions that establish those standards. Another area is, of course, cybersecurity governance. There's also interconnection agreements. I mentioned, the obvious. I'm just really trying to be facetious that the internet's not a cloud. It's made up of actual material networks that are operated by different kinds of companies like AT&T, like Google, like Verizon, and on and on and on around the world. And they make decisions to join their networks together, and they have arrangements that say how the information will be transferred. So there are a lot of power issues around those exchanges. Most importantly, there's the policy role of information intermediaries. So sometime when you get a chance, think about something that you use often on the internet. Would that be Facebook, Twitter, Google, maybe Reddit, and read the terms of service rather than just saying, I agree. And just reading through the terms of service, you get a sense of the kinds of policy decisions that are made, or even just using these services, you understand intuitively that they have to decide when to take down, for example, a Twitter account that could be associated with ISIS or other kinds of terrorism. They have to make decisions about what counts as hate speech online. If they're in Brazil and there are very strong hate speech laws, they make decisions about what to do with cyberbullying and things that are allowable under the First Amendment but may not be allowable in the terms of service. So they're enacting governance. They also have privacy policies, and You just read the privacy policies and you'll see what I mean. They're tracking things like where we are, our location, based on GPS in a phone, based on Wi-Fi antenna location, based on cellular telephone location, and many other things. So these are policies that are established by these private companies. And then I also mentioned IP. What is that? That's just intellectual property. So piracy online is a really big issue. I know that everyone here, I won't even ask you, I know that almost everyone has illegally downloaded a song or a movie, but the companies have a way to stop, excessive piracy by having things like 3 strikes laws, where you get a notice. And I know some of you have gotten that letter where it says you've been using peer-to-peer file sharing protocols, and a lot of this is enforced in the technology. So that's a function of internet governance as well. So there are all these things. Now, one thing I'd like to mention about this is that these have profound public interest implications. So I'm interested in them from an engineering standpoint, but I'm also interested in them from the standpoint of how they establish or instantiate very real public policy concerns. So a few obvious examples: how a web standard is designed affects how people with disabilities can access the internet. So they design features into the technology that enable disabled people to access information. Social media terms of service, as I mentioned, make decisions about everything from privacy to freedom of expression. Encryption standards, the strength of encryption is a decision that affects how secure information can be and the extent to which governments can enact surveillance on citizens. So these are all very political issues. And I mentioned the disputes around domain names, where you might have a company that comes into conflict with another company. So who should own the domain name United.com? Should that be United Airlines? Should it be United Arab Emirates? Should it be the Manchester United? United Van Lines? So these are policy decisions that have to be made. So internet architecture and governance in and of itself is political. So one point I'd like to make is, in addition to these public policy issues that just naturally exist in internet governance arrangements, there also have been some very high-profile destabilizing conflicts. So what are some things around control of the internet that you might have heard of in the news? Has anyone heard about the Apple encryption debate? A little bit? After the San Bernardino shooting and the government wanted access to the Apple device, it's a governance tension between a private company and between a government. You probably have heard of some of the data breaches that have happened. Have you heard of another one? The Sony hack is definitely a politically motivated hack, absolutely, on a company. Mm-hmm. Have you heard, this maybe not as much, but have you heard about a controversy over transitioning U.S. power over part of the internet to an international body? So a few of you have. That's all we heard about in Washington. And Senator Ted Cruz was very vocal about that. He called it Obama's internet surrender. Turning over a function of part of the internet was a very, what would I call it, like a clerical function, but it became very, very politicized in Washington. You might have heard about that. And many other kinds of conflicts. I wanted to mention that I recently served on a Global Commission on Internet Governance as the Director of Research. And it was a multi-year initiative to look at some of these controversies around control of the Internet. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience for me. It was founded by 2 think tanks. You might have heard of Chatham House. It's the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, and then the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. And it was chaired by Carl Bildt, who was the former Prime Minister of Sweden, and had about 25 people on it. And so we met in different places around the world and asked the question, what is a strategic direction for internet policy that can help preserve democratic values? Now, the reason that this was formed is because countries like China and Russia really have their act together when it comes to policies towards the internet. And they have very, very strong systems of censorship, for example. and very strong systems of other kinds of information controls. But countries that are more democratic-leaning have really just been kind of letting things unfold in an organic way. And the idea behind this was that there was a little bit more of a need for coordination about how to preserve democratic values in the internet. Now, at the same time, there was a lot of controversy over the disclosures about the NSA in the U.S. Enacting surveillance on information. So there are many, many different controversies around the world over what is the appropriate level of points of control over the internet. Now, one thing that came out of this, there was just mentioned here, we did a global survey in 2 years of 23,000 users around the world in 24 different countries. And the survey was all about cybersecurity and trust. And those results are all available online if anyone is interested in the data. I just wanted to mention one quick note from this. And that's that after the disclosures about NSA surveillance, 64% of people were more concerned about their online privacy compared to a year ago. And that was really around the world. Brazil came out first, India, Nigeria, Egypt. But in general, there was more concern about online privacy. This is just one finding. But what it does is it shows that there is some loss of trust in systems of internet governance. And there are several reasons for this. It's not just surveillance. It's also increasing awareness of the business models upon which all of this is based. So what do you pay for when you get online? Not very much, right? You use free social media, free email, Yelp, Reddit. Who pays for any of that? It's all free, right? So it's not that money is not changing hands. These are, multi-billion-dollar industries. It's just that money is changing hands behind the scenes. And these are business models in which we use free platforms in exchange for the collection of personal data about us and the targeted delivery of online advertising. So that's how the business model works. There's increasing awareness of that, and it's creating some concern. Some loss of trust has also come about from the high-profile cybersecurity breaches. So the combination of government surveillance, the business model that gathers personal data about us, and the institutions that run the internet that are increasingly controversial, and the data breaches, has brought about some loss of trust. I also want to suggest another cross-border theme, and that's the theme that the internet infrastructure, the actual technology, is now a proxy for state power. And I had a book actually recently come out. It's an edited book that I edited with some of my colleagues. And this is about the ways in which governments and other kinds of forces are co-opting the infrastructure of the internet for political purposes having nothing to do with keeping it operational. So they're co-opting it. Now, of course, there's a long history of turning to infrastructure for political means. Can you think of some of those examples? I would say the Egyptian internet outage was probably one of the best examples to cut off internet and phone service to its citizens. Those kinds of attacks that disrupt governments, like the Estonia attack I mentioned, definitely an example. And law enforcement is increasingly turning to parts of the internet infrastructure to stop piracy. So this has been happening for a long time. But what I'm suggesting is that we need to extend this concept of governance by infrastructure to the phenomenon of governance by tampering with the actual infrastructure. And I'd like to go through a couple of examples of this. So what I'm saying is that there's the imposition of laws and technical changes and other kinds of requirements to actually modify the design of the internet, not to make it operate efficiently from an engineering standpoint, but to bring about some kind of public policy outcome. So the few I mentioned here, let me try to briefly go through these. One example, of course, involves, I'll mention the encryption one. Government interest in weakening encryption. So you probably have been following the news. FBI Director Comey, back from Washington, is in the news a lot around the election. But he was also in the news a while ago when he called for private companies to build in backdoors into encryption so that governments can unencrypt scrambled information that is sent over the internet. On the other hand, the engineers that develop the standards for the internet, it's actually, if you're interested, it's actually called the Internet Engineering Task Force. If anyone wants to write a paper about that, it's very interesting. The IETF, all of this is a bunch of acronyms. But they designed the standards. And they said that surveillance, whether of content or things around content, they view that as a technical attack that should be addressed by protocol design choices that would, at a minimum, make indiscriminate surveillance more expensive. So you can see how that would really come into conflict with the government interest in fighting terrorism and enforcing different kinds of laws. Google also announced at that same time that they would use an encrypted approach to email. And so there's more and more encryption. In fact, I ran into one of the developers of something called public key cryptography, he's a very elderly scholar now. He was a great inventor. And he said the thing that has surprised him the most is they never dreamed in the 1970s that not all information would be encrypted all the time. So it's a choice to not encrypt everything. But a lot is encrypted, and that often comes into conflict with law enforcement and national security goals. So there are increasing calls to build in backdoors to encryption. So that's one example. Now another one I list here, data localization laws. Has anyone ever heard what that is about? There's interest in setting laws, and in fact a lot of laws have been set, including in Russia and in Brazil and in other places around the world, that are trying to require private companies like Google and even banks to store information within national borders. So here's your bits and borders example. They're saying, well, how does it work normally? The truth is that technology does not map very neatly onto borders. So a company that, for example, is in the United States might have servers distributed around the world. They might have registered a domain name in another country, and they might have a call center operating in India. And so the information flows around all of that. But some of the laws are requiring companies to store consumer data within national borders. And there can be a very appropriate reason for that, concern about privacy and concern about foreign surveillance. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to get that to map how the technology actually works. So let's say that I decided to leave, not be a professor anymore, and maybe start a social media company. I would be required under those laws to have a server in any country in which I wanted to do business. So that is an example of changing the nature of how the internet works for some kind of a public policy issue. So that's one that I did want to mention. I'll toss out just one more example because I would like to, if nothing else, I'd like you to understand what the domain name system is today. So how many people here have heard of the domain name system? So a few of you have, right? The domain name system it's the center of the internet, really. It is a system that maps the words that we use, like CNN.com or Colgate.edu or Reddit.com or LauraDeanArtist.org or any other domain name. It maps what we type into a computer, type into the phone, into a number that routers use to get information to its destination. So in the same way that we have physical addresses that are unique, like a postal address, when we use information on the internet, we have a unique number that explains where information is located. So when information is sent over the internet, it's actually broken up into what are called packets, just buckets of content, and each packet of information has the destination number. It's called an Internet Protocol address. It's just a series of zeros and ones, a unique binary number. So what the domain name system does is it translates between that name and translates it into the number so that routers can route the information to their destination. Does that make sense? So in a way, it's like the phone book for the internet. It's the internet's phone book, just to give it an oversimplified description. What does that have to do with any kind of civil liberties or public policy? Well, it has a lot to do with it. Because the domain space, the domain namespace, is a namespace. It's also a speech space. So should something like, let's see, there was a case where someone introduced a top-level domain like .com, but instead of that, .gay. And Saudi Arabia, the government, said that they didn't think that that was a morally acceptable space. So who makes the decision about that? Who decides when there's Amazon asking for the .amazon top-level domain, and then the countries try to say, well, that should be belonging to the countries. There are many, many different examples of this. I could go on and on. The intellectual property right one is a big one. Trademarks, where someone might own a trademark, and what do you do in those kinds of battles? Well, it turns out that because the domain name system is this centralized point, it's distributed on technology, but it's centralized in the standpoint that it is hierarchical, and information has to pass through this. So, what if you wanted to block access to information? You don't have to actually go to the server and block it. You can just go to the domain name system and you can say, instead of pointing to that person's address, to let's say your home address, if we were talking about the real world, let's point to someone else's address. So, for example, if you have a website that sells Louis Vuitton knockoffs or pirated movies or something like that, the authorities can just go to this system and point it in another direction. So that is an area where a lot of changes are being made right now, and I think you'll increasingly see it in the news, and I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that area. So if you look at these different issues, requirements to store information within the borders, interest in building in backdoors into encryption, using these kinds of common systems like the domain name system to block information. What do these all have in common? Well, they all involve attempts to alter infrastructure in a way to achieve some kind of a policy objective. They all involve questions about implications for human rights, like free speech. And they all raise security issues. For example, if you build a backdoor in encryption so that government can access it, what is to stop a hacker from accessing it? You're building in some ways, a vulnerability that could be exploited for criminal activity. Data localization approaches that store consumer information locally, that actually concentrates data and can raise some kinds of security issues too. And they also portend this question of, will we have a universal internet, or will we have an internet that is fragmented based on national borders? So that's why I'm so happy to be discussing some of the bordered issues, the bits and borders issues. I do want to raise one other theme for your consideration. And it has to do with some new kinds of conflicts. And this phenomenon that I want to talk about is that the internet is no longer, I'll just say it provocatively, it's no longer a communication system. It's also a control system in which more things and people are connected to the internet. So of course it still is a communication network, but it also is connecting more things than people. What are some of those things? Baby monitors, home alarm systems, industrial control sensors, surveillance cameras, drones, wireless heart monitors, wearable technologies. So these don't involve communications between two of us in this room. It's between things. It's the Internet of Things issue. So what are the prospects for human rights in this context? What it means is that questions about Internet rights and questions about Internet freedom are no longer merely about content. They are about the underlying system of technical infrastructure. So the new privacy issues come about when our cars are always connected to the internet. So there's a record of where we always drive. New concerns about speech come into play. New concerns about hacking and what kinds of vulnerabilities we could have. So if you think about an outage in cyberspace being an outage of our social life, well, an outage in cyberspace will soon be an outage of all the things around us and our appliances. So hacking in to stop a Twitter feed is one thing, but hacking in to change someone's alarm system or change how a car drives is an entirely different situation. So attention to governance has to include attention to these kinds of issues. I did list a few things here on this slide that are examples of the kinds of questions that really embed more directly into the material world rather than just in the communication world. So those include digital currencies, where currencies are entirely online, like Bitcoin. Some people pay their tuition in Bitcoin in some universities. And you know about the bad things about Bitcoin. If you haven't heard about the dark web, you might want to look into the dark web a little bit. It's just an area of the internet that uses strong anonymization technologies, and a lot of the transactions are done in these digital currencies where it can't be tracked. So child pornography, human trafficking, illegal drugs, illegal arms, these are things that get transacted through digital currencies. And these digital currencies are also used for a variety of really good applications as well, but it's an example of bleeding into a new area outside of communications. I would put augmented reality and gaming in that area, where the material world is coming into cyberspace more. Cyber conflict, where attacks on cyber infrastructure are also attacks on material, industrial infrastructure. So the most well-known example of that was a computer worm called Stuxnet, which was used to target the centrifuges in Iranian nuclear reactors to disrupt that. And of course, digital archiving is a complicated issue around governance. How will we preserve our digital and material artifacts going forward when even things that I wrote 10 years ago I can't access anymore on different kinds of computers? And then the Internet of Things that I mentioned. So all of these are interesting examples of how the policy issues are really bleeding into the real world and outside of the communications realm. So just one final slide on some themes, and then I would be very interested to listen to your comments and questions about anything about Internet policy or Internet governance. It could be something I mentioned or something completely different in the things that you're thinking about. But I did want to raise a few examples of themes that are at this intersection of bits and borders. Well, the main thing is that Internet infrastructure really has to be thought of as a global public policy problem that really is as important as climate change, that really is as important as environmental issues, that's important as protecting human rights, because so many issues come into play. The other theme that kind of threads throughout this talk is that the arrangements of the technology really are arrangements of public policy, so they need a lot of attention. And of course, the infrastructure does not map neatly onto national borders, so this has really produced a complicated geopolitics and new kinds of questions when state laws and state norms come into direct conflict with how things actually work on the internet and some of the problems that arise. And you probably noticed that values are always in conflict when you look at an area of internet control. One example is the right to be forgotten law in the European Union. It was a ruling that gave people the right to take down some information about them online. That sounds like a great thing, but what if what's being taken down is a news article? Then it reminds you that one person's privacy is another person's freedom of expression. So these are issues that come into play. Oftentimes privacy, which is a very important value, and anonymity, very important value in democracy, comes into tension with law enforcement and with national security. So a lot of those issues were raised here. And I think you know this, that internet governance is not just one issue. And I say that not trying to be facetious, but because I get the question all the time from the media about, well, who should control the internet? Should it be the US government? Should it be Google? Should it be the United Nations? Or should it be one of these new institutions like ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers? Who should control the internet? Well, you know that question makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because there's not just one system of internet governance, but many different functions that are necessary to keep it operational. And finally, that internet governance will just become more and more complicated as in order of magnitude more things than people are connected to the internet, whether those are industrial systems, home appliances, health monitoring devices, drones. More of these are connected than people on the planet. So put that all in combination with the recognition that all of this infrastructure is increasingly recognized by governments around the world as a proxy for power and by powerful corporations as a way to enact their business models. It's a pretty interesting area, the whole realm of internet governance. So those are my remarks, and I want to thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
So you say that the idea of an international internet governance is impossible, but do you think it's possible that someday forward, similarly to how kind of after the Second World War there was a new kind of way of looking at the international community, and like when you look at the United Nations and how that was set up, and how kind of a new system for a world economy was set up, do you think that in the future there could be a similar parallel to an international organization to deal with competing national interests regarding the internet?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a lot of different layers of internet governance, and even now, some of those layers do involve international agreements, whether it's bilateral treaties or you probably have been following some of the trade, the more global trade agreements. They can be very controversial, but a lot of the decisions within those have to do with the cross-border flow of data. So you can give that as an example of one area of internet governance where it does involve international agreement right now. Another area has to do with some cybersecurity agreements. Another area has to do with standard setting, where there is this organization that's part of the United Nations called the International Telecommunication Union, and they run and coordinate some things related to spectrum allocation and standard setting. So there are some examples. And the great question that you're asking is, where are other possibilities for agreements? And it seems like there's a huge opportunity for that, and I think there probably will be some. But in other areas, it doesn't make sense to just have a single actor, meaning governments, get involved. So that's this general area. I didn't use this term, but it's often described as multi-stakeholder governance. But it's not that all of these functions are multi-stakeholder, where there are different kinds of actors that are involved in the agreements, like private industry, civil society, academics in some cases, and governments. It's that if you look at the totality of all the functions, these actors are involved in different areas. Some are purely private sector, and that's probably appropriate. Some functions purely government, and that's appropriate. And then these other in-the-middle kinds of things, like the management of names and numbers on the internet, it's a variety of actors. So I think the answer is yes to what you said, and I hope that there is more agreement, especially in the area of cyber conflict, because I think that's one of the greatest vulnerabilities right now, where there's a weaponization of infrastructure, and given what is at stake for the economy and society over different kinds of outages, hopefully there will be some kind of international agreements that restrain that, at least even something as simple as restraining attacks on civilian targets over the internet.
Hi, so I wanted to ask you about the Apple FBI case. When the FBI went to Apple and said, we want you to design your code so that we can have access to this information, if I'm not mistaken, Apple's legal team made several arguments, but one of them that's most interesting to me is that code is free speech, and that you can't compel us to write code this way because it's a language. We wrote our code in this way, this interpretation, and it's therefore free speech, and you can't make us do anything about that. I don't know how convincing I buy that argument, but it's an argument that's been made by Apple's legal team. I'm interested to hear whether people in your area of expertise find that argument at all valid, or what implications the idea of code as free speech could have.
I personally don't think that that's the best argument. I don't think that's the best argument for it at all.
I don't think so.
I don't think it is. But what is a good argument is that they, as part of their business, need to provide privacy for their customers, right? And that information should be easily obtained by a warrant, That's a good argument. See, there was something really different about this case, because companies like Apple turn over information to the U.S. government and also to other governments every single day. They don't just turn over information, they block information. So every day, Facebook takes down, hundreds and thousands of things, depending on the day. They're handing over data, when it's a legitimate government request. What was so different about this case was that they weren't being asked to hand over data about a particular user. They were being asked to give the technical features and the technical designs over to the government in order to break into that phone and therefore possibly have access to the phone in the foreseeable future. So that would be a really big business problem for Apple. I think that is, a valid argument. Now, when there is a lawful request, a company has to turn it over. There's no question about that. But here's the problem with that. They receive lawful requests from Thailand also. And Thailand has a law that makes it illegal to insult a monarch. Go to jail. Did you see what I'm saying? You have to think about this as a global issue, not just about what the U.S. government is doing to try to block terrorism or to enact surveillance. It's all across the world, and in some places, like in Brazil, it's illegal to hate speech that is considered free speech here is actually highly illegal in Brazil. In Germany, there are prohibitions on the exchange of information about Nazi material. In Vietnam, people can be jailed for saying certain things. In China, there are large restrictions. So companies like Apple have to navigate requests from different kinds of governments every day. And the minute you say, okay, I'm going to hand over the code, do they then hand it over to China as well? Do they hand it over to Russia? So it's one of the complexities here has to do with the fact that it wasn't just about that one user, about that one device. It was about making it more universal to have the back doors or front doors into the device. Very complicated example, but that is the perfect example that indicates the values that are conflicting. So you want national security, but you also want privacy, and it just blows up in a case like that.
You talked about potentially a move that could happen or maybe already be happening to move towards the idea of having multiple internets that are segregated, potentially on borders, potentially not on borders. Have you looked at all to what extent that's already happening and to what extent that movement is going in that direction?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I actually just came out with an article called One Internet, an evidentiary basis for fragmentation and universality on the internet that looks at the different kinds of fragmentation that already exist. So in a lot of ways, we do have a universal internet. It's growing. I can get on the internet anywhere around the world, but on the other hand, we really do have a lot of kinds of fragmentation. So someone can make the argument that there's fragmentation because the internet in Japanese looks quite different than the internet in English. You could make arguments that we have a fragmented internet because in some places there are very strong systems of censorship that block access to entire applications that we can access here. We also have different kinds of internet experiences because of access discrepancies, because of the digital divide. So those are examples that could be argued of fragmentation. And then when you look at the data localization laws that I mentioned, that creates a fragmented internet. When you look at how the domain name system is being, there's like local redirection in the domain name system. So I think there are movements towards fragmentation, but I have a very optimistic view of the internet as one internet, and that it's better for freedom of expression and better for innovation for that to continue.
Communication and control to part of the internet. Is it not true that we already have two internet, like the power grid are not on the internet? Like in terms of security, there is already something divided, or is that not true?
Well, it's very difficult to find a company or an industry that is not connected to the internet, even though the power grid may not be controlled by the internet. but there may be, like what happened in the case of the Iranian nuclear reactor. There was a computer connected to the network, and someone was able to implant code on that computer. If you look at something like, name a sector, the financial sector, we know that there have been massive data breaches in consumer records. Here's the most interesting thing. Even someone who has never been on the internet ever, like, does anyone have a grandparent who's never been on the internet? Maybe. Maybe one. You might have a grandparent who's, well, you need to take care of that and help them. I think they would love YouTube, get them on. But they may shop at Target, and so their credit card information may be stored on Target's servers. So when there was a breach in Target's data network, even someone who's not on the internet can be affected. So it kind of bleeds together in really interesting ways, even when there is that fragmentation. Now, it could be an argument, and this might be where you're going with this, it could be an argument that fragmentation is better in the Internet of Things, because then you wouldn't have such massive cybersecurity breaches. So maybe it would affect Chrysler cars, but not Toyota cars, if there's some, looking into the future with driverless cars and the kinds of hacking that can be of concern. So very interesting issues around fragmentation.
How do websites that probably offer pirated material like Locker or Pirate Bay still operate? Why aren't they shut down?
Well, they're often shut down, and then they reappear under a different domain name. But in some cases, I'll just give you several different answers to that. Well, first of all, I'll ask this group a question. Who has received a letter asking to stop using BitTorrent to illegally download material, just by a show of hands? Okay, we only have 3 in here. Okay, so sometimes when you operate that kind of a centralized system that relies on peer-to-peer protocol, peer-to-peer file sharing, that can be used to identify who is engaging in the piracy. So that could be used to find out an end user that's downloading things, and then they can go after the end users from that. In other cases, there are many, many examples of piracy sites taken down on a regular basis. In the United States alone, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, you might have heard of ICE, they have a program where they go to the people who control the domain name system, and they say redirect sites away from these. So they're not actually taking down the site, but they use it to redirect so that people can't access it. But it's like that game Whack-A-Mole, where other sites then emerge. And at the same time, the other point is that industries that develop movies and music and video games are finding other ways to have business models because they recognize that piracy is here to stay. And we have a whole we're a whole generation that is used to accessing information for free. And so other ways to monetize, whether through iTunes, whether through freemium services where you have a subscription to Pandora and listen to music so that you don't have to listen to the ads. I think that there are also market remedies to that sort of thing. But that's an excellent question because it's not that difficult to take down sites. It doesn't regulate the content. It doesn't regulate the content. It's just a pointer to the content. But the person, really an institution, you've probably heard of GoDaddy, for example. They're accredited to register domain names. They can be notified of the site and withdraw the domain name, so they could be used to take it down in the same way that other companies can be used to take down, redirect from the site. But that's a really interesting question. Because there's something, I don't really even know what term to use without getting too technical, but there are ways to have almost the same domain name, but just with a different, what's called top-level domain. So, for example, when WikiLeaks.org was taken down, when they released information about the sensitive State Department cables a while ago, They were taken down. That website could no longer be found. But they quickly came up on WikiLeaks.ch, which was I think that was in Switzerland, right? Or they could come up in another area. So they could kind of domain name shop and come back online.
Any time for one last question?
This is like a multiple part question. So first is, do you think that the U.S. and other developed democracies are sufficiently ahead of the curve on cybersecurity compared to countries like Russia and China? And then my second part would be, obviously this is an important issue, and I think it should take a larger place in politics and in the political discussion than it does today. But how do you think we can integrate that into the political discussion in sufficient depth without having it be too far out of reach of the average voter?
I think the last part of that is happening. I'm going to start with your last question first, because there have been examples of high-profile consumer data breaches that have gotten attention. There have been examples of controversies over net neutrality, where even because of late-night television discussing it, people are getting involved. There have been examples of boycotts, such as the boycott and series of petitions around something called the Stop Online Piracy Act. So I think that the general public is becoming more and more involved in these issues. I think training the next generation of people to get involved, like for those of you who might want to go into the issue of internet policy, technology policy, internet governance, cybersecurity, these are very quickly growing areas, and having educated young people who go into this area, I think that's another solution as well. Policymakers are definitely on top of this now and interested. But that leads to your first question. Cybersecurity, not taken care of. It's not taken care of. You know that from the kinds of breaches that happen every day. But part of the complexity of that is that most of the infrastructure of the internet is not owned, the vast majority, not owned by governments, but they're owned by the private industry. So, for example, a bank is responsible for providing the security for their own infrastructure. The university the government doesn't run the security here, right? It's your university. So what can the government do? Well, there is a lot that governments can do, and a lot of it has to do with requiring companies that develop products and maybe have a security breach or a vulnerability to have some kind of accountability about that. There are things that can be done on an international stage, coming back to your question that you asked earlier, and there can be things like insurance risk markets to deal with cybersecurity breaches, and that's really important to do, especially with the advent of the Internet of Things, where all of the things around us will be interconnected. It's amazing that we haven't had a massive cybersecurity breach, so you could say that this has been a great success, right? We've had outages. Did anyone get affected by the pretty big outage a couple of weeks ago when Twitter went down and some others? It was big on the East Coast. You were affected by that. I remember just going to BBN. I couldn't access. There were several sites that were down, but that's not a widespread outage. So in a way, cybersecurity has been a big success. But I would say that it's not. That's more just fortunate than anything else, and that it's something that requires a lot more attention from governments. Great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.